So I understand that we're ready to go. That was a wonderful lunch. I understand there's a very special lady who provided that food. And I don't know if she's here, but I think that was just fantastic. Thank you so much. She's from Romania, I believe. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so this afternoon we're going to do some really interesting stuff. Some of it is a little controversial. Hope you can handle that. You think you can handle some controversial stuff? Okay, good. Let's pray, shall we? All right. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word and all of the wisdom that you give us, for providing us this opportunity in a free country to be able to discuss like this and to learn and to grow into your truth, into your character as we learn more about you. Please guide us through these issues. Some of them are challenging, but we ask that you would help us to understand. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so this is about how to benefit from principles in specific biblical laws. So what we did earlier was first an introduction, the overview of law as a whole, and then we looked at methodology for applying particular laws, and then we looked at how some affect our understanding of and enrich our understanding of Jesus' life and the gospel. And now we're going to look at specific laws and really dig in. Okay, so criterion for application, let's just remind ourselves of that one sentence rule of thumb where I ended last time. A law should be kept to the extent that its principle can be applied, unless the New Testament removes the reason for its application. All right, now that is not inspired. That's what I wrote after years of study. Okay, so as I said, you have to check it out for yourselves and test it, but that's the best I can do at this point. So what we need to do is to identify timeless principles on a case-by-case basis. It's not just a matter of one size fits all. The way we discover the principles depends upon the nature of the particular law. Our aim is to understand a law in its cultural context and bridge the gap to modern culture. Culture is not the authority, but must be taken into account. We need to read, think, and then do. As I mentioned, I think it was this morning, some people want to have knee-jerk obedience. That's just, you read and you do. Knee-jerk obedience, huh? Yeah. Well, that's not the way it works, because Paul says, rightly dividing the word of truth. That means analyzing. That means thinking, using the gray matter between these two ears. So you can't just read and then automatically do, because you may end up accomplishing exactly the opposite of what God intended, and that would not work out too well. For example, with levirate marriage, for example, if two brothers dwelling together and the wife of one of them dies, leaving no children. Now, what if in ancient Israel, the other brother already had a wife? Huh? What happens then? Well, there's two options. He can refuse to take that woman, or he can take her as the law really calls for and recommends. There is an option for getting out of it in Deuteronomy 25, but it involves shaming the person who refuses. Okay? So it could end up, there's no provision, there's no exception clause that says in Deuteronomy 25 that if the other brother already has a wife, that he shouldn't take the wife of his brother. So what does that mean? That could involve taking a second wife. Huh? Now, if we try to carry out that law in our modern culture, knee-jerk obedience, what's going to happen? It's going to defame the gospel, because we're not living in that ancient Israelite culture. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay? All right. So that's just an example. I know that there are some, including a good friend of mine who's an expert on sexuality in the Old Testament, who thinks that he may be right, that the biblical text is assuming that the brother is unmarried because they're living together. Raymond Westbrook, an expert on biblical law, says that what that means is they're living on an undivided estate. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're living under the same roof, or that the younger brother is a dependent living with his older brother who's married. So there's, however, it's true what I said, that there is no exception clause in Deuteronomy 25. If he's already married, he doesn't have to take this other woman who is his sister-in-law. Okay, we need to differentiate timeless principles from culturally conditioned applications or examples. That is really crucial. And sometimes it's challenging to differentiate. Is this a principle by itself, or is this an application, a culturally conditioned application? So we're going to look at some cases. Let's first look at you shall not murder. So we're going to start off with something that's pretty obvious, and then we're going to work into some things that are less familiar. So first of all, sixth of the Ten Commandments, you shall not murder. The Hebrew word ratzach, the verb here, in fact, this is only 2 words in Hebrew. Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. And shall not murder is all one Hebrew word, which is from the root ratzach. This murder, or rather this word for murder, is here in the 6th commandment. The participle of the same root, that is, it's a verbal form, which is a participle, also refers to an accidental manslayer in Numbers 35 and also in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. Now, you're probably familiar with those passages where somebody accidentally kills someone. They're swinging an axe to cut down a tree, and the axe head comes off the axe handle, flies through the air, and kills somebody. This can happen. Nearly happened to me. Not an axe. I was working for Helmer's Construction at PUC, and we were demolishing a temporary loading dock because we were doing something for the book bindery, I think it was. And so we're demolishing this temporary loading dock. Now, I had a lot of energy in those days. Got a little less now. You wouldn't know it probably. I had a 28-ounce hammer. It's one of those hamburger head hammers for framing. It has the, it's not just flat on the end. It's kind of, so that when you hit the nail, it goes really straight. 28 ounce. Normal hammer is 16 ounce. So this is a big hammer. And I was very vigorously going, boom, boom, knocking off these legs, which were attached by 16 penny nails, on this temporary loading dock that we had upended. Okay? On one of those swings, accidentally, my hammer flew from my hand, flew through the air, and went inches above the head of a man who worked at Physical Plant. And I never ever saw him move fast in his life, except this time. He happened to notice out of the corner of his eye and duck like that. Otherwise, it would have killed him. It just would have killed him. See? So this is the kind of thing that happens. I still have that hammer, but I'm very careful with it. All right, and he's still alive. Okay, so what happens is this person this is not first-degree murder. Okay, this is manslaughter, which is an accidental kind of thing. And the word also applies to that. But the meaning doesn't apply in the 6th commandment because a commandment doesn't prohibit an accident. See how this works? Now, I've seen in print recently the idea that because in Numbers chapter 35, you have this word referring to something that is not intentional murder, that therefore this word can mean any kind of killing, and therefore the King James Version is correct when it says you shall not kill, and that refers to all killing. That is an incorrect interpretation, and the reason why, this is something that we call illegitimate totality transfer, where you're transferring a meaning from one context to another without taking the context into account. So James Barr, in his 1961 book, The Semantics of Biblical Language, calls this illegitimate totality transfer. Okay, now let me illustrate, and you'll understand immediately what it's all about. Anybody, I can see a lot of you are a little bit older like me. Anybody here ever watch the Flintstones cartoon? You watch the Flintstones. It's kind of fun, huh? Yeah. And I didn't very much, but when I went to kids' houses, friends of mine, sometimes they had TV on. And do you remember the theme song for the Flintstones? Do you remember that? I'm not a singer, but here it goes. We'll have a yabba-dabba-doo time, a dabba-doo time. We'll have a, what's the next word? Gay old time. That proves that the Flintstones were homosexual. I've used that illustration with the GC president in the audience. That proves it. No, because the word has changed its meaning. You can't take the meaning of a word in one context and then transfer it to another context and say it has to mean the same thing here. That's not the way words work. right? So to say, okay, it can mean accidental killing here. This is the exception, the only place that happens. And therefore, it has to mean accidental killing here. But you look at this context, and it's a prohibition. You don't prohibit accidents. Therefore, the correct translation is, you shall not murder. Not just you shall not kill, referring to any kind of killing. Does that make sense? Okay, so, and here's more proof of it. Doesn't rule out all killing. Killing animals for food for sacrifice. Is that killing? Food and sacrifice. Properly administering capital punishment, which the Lord calls for. That's killing, right? What about killing in justifiable self-defense? Exodus 22, verse 2, in English that is, says that if somebody is breaking into your house and they get killed, then and you kill them, then you don't have any blood guilt, meaning you're not responsible. You're not morally responsible for the death of that person. But if the sun has risen, then you're responsible. There is blood guilt. Why? Because when someone's breaking into your house to steal, it says it's a thief. It's a thief. They're breaking in to steal at night. You don't know what they're out to do. You may think they're going to kill you. During daylight, you can assess the situation, and therefore, you can know if they're just planning to rob you or if they're planning to kill you. So this means that if your life is in danger, this is justifiable self-defense, including using lethal force, and that is justifiable by the Bible. Okay, most Christians don't know that, or many don't, although many would practice it anyway. Justifiable killing by police is necessary to maintain order. I know a person who is a Seventh-day Adventist Christian police officer, and he happened to be at a situation. They were called to deal with a very dangerous they assumed it was a dangerous individual who was out of control. And when they got to the scene where he was, and it was night, this officer just happened to glance up, and there's the guy standing on a little bit of a rise with a high-powered rifle pointed towards the policeman, him and a few of his buddies. He yells at the guy, "Drop your gun." The guy didn't. So he took him out, meaning he killed him, to save the lives of himself and his buddies. Is that justifiable? Absolutely. Now, that, you see, if there's an element of racism, prejudice, all those kind of things, then that's another issue. But just basic justifiable killing by police is necessary to maintain order and to protect life. So there's nothing that is wrong with that, and this is not just you shall not kill. For the sixth commandment, it means you shall not murder. Now here's a challenging one. Justifiable war to protect or liberate a country as corporate self-defense or to save lives. Now, what we just said about police action means that you're defending life, right? What about if it's not just one person with a high-powered rifle? What if it's 100,000 or 30,000 or 10,000 that are coming in to invade the borders of your country, to steal, rape, pillage, and murder? Do you have a right to kill them? The biblical answer is yes. Now, when I was 19 years old, I had to sign up for the draft at the end of the Vietnam War, 19-something. It was the last century. Okay, and I did. And, I chose full conscientious objector status. So I wouldn't even go into war as a medic, okay, because my reason I gave for that at the time was that any position that you hold in a military organization is going to support the war effort, all right? In other words, it's a machine. You got people maintaining the machinery, you got people supplying, you got people patching up the wounded, all of the rest. The war is a machine. And the guys out at the end, they're the guys that are pulling the triggers, and shooting the bullets and the rockets and all the rest of it. That's just part of the whole machine. And if you're part of that machine, you're responsible. So that's the reason I did that at that time. Now, I say justifiable war to protect or liberate a country. However, since then, I've sort of adjusted my worldview was just very, very pacifistic. And it still is to a large extent. I hate war. At the same time, we live in a free country because People would be willing to put their lives on the line and be willing to put other people's lives on the line if they cross our border. Ellen White saw some Swiss young people in Switzerland when she was there who were members of the Swiss defensive military. They were Adventist young people, and she was proud of them. I have to look up that reference again. It's a purely neutral country, no thought of invading any other country, and a country has a right to defend their borders. That's legitimate. That's like police action. We do not have a right to go and invade some other country. So in the book, 1,000 Shall Fall, it's the story of the father of Gerhard Hasel by his sister, who was at PUC, Susie Mundy. Yeah? Some of you know Susie Mundy. She was the younger sister of Gerhard Hasel. And I think it was Franz was the father, if I'm not mistaken. And he was drafted, he had no choice, into Hitler's army. Now this is a criminal enterprise. It's a machine of mass murder. And he was forced like a slave to work in this. And so what he did was something that risked his life. He threw away his gun, and he had a wooden gun carved, and he polished it black with shoe polish or something like that, and had it looking like it was a real gun. And if he'd been discovered, he would have been shot on the spot, okay? But he was refusing to participate in that kind of enterprise at the risk of his life, and he was right. And when it came to the Vietnam War, it's really murky morally in a lot of ways. I mean, true is to defend South Vietnam and democracy and so on and so forth, but there was also, when you get multinational corporation interests involved and all kinds of things, war is a very, very complex thing. And I just didn't feel comfortable at that point with that. Now, I speak to veterans, including veterans which are my students at PUC, at Andrews, quite a bit. And you see, when you say that the Sixth Commandment says you shall not kill at all, what you're doing is you're labeling those veterans in the U.S. military as murderers by just participating in the military. And I would really hesitate to do that. In World War II, we went to liberate people who were enslaved. Did you know there were about 10 million people enslaved by the Nazis? Enslaved. Besides all the ones that were murdered. Enslaved in factories under brutal conditions, making war machinery, armaments, and stuff like that. We went and we liberated Europe. It's the greatest generation, it's called, right? And that, biblically speaking, what happened when the Gibeonites were being threatened by all the other Canaanites? The Gibeonites had made a pact with the Israelites. What did the Israelites do? They went to help the Gibeonites, and they fought against the others to protect the Gibeonites from getting overrun and slaughtered. And so that, to me, is a biblical precedent showing to protect your borders, to liberate another country from oppression is perfectly acceptable. Now, we can, in the discussion period at the end, we can debate. You know, you can bring up issues. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I'm gathering from the Bible. Okay. The positive, timeless principle in the Sixth Commandment that's behind it is respect for life, which covers a lot of other things besides just not murdering. No unjustifiable killing of humans or animals. Okay? Draining the blood when killing animals for food, I talked about that this morning, is respecting life. Nurturing rather than harming the health of others and oneself. A lot of people commit suicide by overwork, which is a temptation. I visited Australia, and I was up on the Gold Coast, and my uncle, who lives up there, said, see those apartment buildings, luxury condos, full of widows, of men who were trying to get ahead, make as much money as they could, and then they died prematurely because they were killing themselves by overwork. Okay, that is a form of suicide. And forcing other people to work beyond what they should is also a form of slow murder. Okay? Taking care of the environment, after all, this is where we live. It affects our health. It affects whether we can live here. That is an important part of it. Yeah, you know, it's a shame that the environment is an issue that, say, conservative, really solid Adventist Christians haven't really gotten onto very much. The people that are really into protecting the environment tend to be those who are more on the left-wingers. But in the Bible, It's very much a very important concern. We have to be caring and nurturing for our environment. That was the first work of Adam and Eve, wasn't it? Okay, self-defense. This is a challenging one. Okay, here's the law here. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there should be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there should be blood guilt. The principle is justifiable self-defense, but within the limit of what's necessary to protect yourself and one's family. So when the sun has risen, you can't just kill a person. You've got to check out what it is. Maybe other people will be awake. You can call for help, and so on and so forth. It's just assumed that that would be the case. Now, if you really are in a situation where your life is really threatened, it's clear that it's not just a thief. This says a thief, see? But it's a murderer breaking in who wants to do something to you or rape your wife or something like that, then that's different. But this is if they're a thief. So justifiable self-defense within the limits of what's necessary to protect oneself and one's family. This law focuses on what is reasonable defense against burglary. If someone killed a thief who was breaking in during the night, he was not charged because he would not have known it was just a thief. But if it happened during the day, he was guilty of a crime, on the assumption that in the daylight, the thief posed no threat to the homeowner's life, could be stopped and made to pay restitution. That's the Net Bible, New English Translation, Bible Study Note. And I recommend the Net Bible is a good translation, and they have excellent translators' notes and Bible study notes. Just mini commentary, but right to the point, dealing with the Hebrew language aspects. Very understandable. This is one of those notes, and you can get it quite easily. I recommend that. I've got it on my Accordance Bible software program. Okay, but if anyone, look at this text, 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This is in the context of caring for widows. But it's referring to a broader principle. It's not just about monetary, economic, or food, or whatever, or housing for widows. This is a broader principle. If you're not helping to take care of your relatives, it says you're worse than an unbeliever, because they actually do take care of their relatives, right? Now, what does that mean? Let me give you an example. I was told recently, I forget where I was, maybe it was in another country, because I have been in another country recently. I was told that there was an Adventist man who believed that you have to turn the other cheek, and that ruled out all self-defense. And when his wife was being raped, he stood by and did nothing about it. Okay? Is that biblical? The answer is absolutely not. He broke this principle, because one of the key issues of being a man in a household is to protect your family members. That's taking care of your family. Not just providing their food and their housing and everything. You've got to protect them. And I've been in a situation where I've been very much aware of danger and possibility and was really ready to do whatever it took. Okay? So if someone is attacking your family members, you do biblically whatever it takes. And if the attacker gets hurt in the process of whatever it takes, that is just one of the occupational risks of being that kind of person. Okay? And I'll give you an example. There was a young guy who was at PUC, became a friend of ours. He discovered that his biological father was Jewish. He went to Israel, became Israeli, joined the paratroops, and had a brutal time. We visited him during that time. The Israeli paratroops is like the Marines on steroids. It's really, really rough. And they learned all kinds of things, hand-to-hand combat, the whole works. He did duty in Gaza, which is really rough. And then he came back to the U.S. And he went to study at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he was also at the time studying Ruku Kempo, pressure point karate. But he was studying medicine or psychology. I think it was psychology at the time. And maybe he was baiting, I don't know. But he was walking around in Philadelphia at 2 a.m. You just don't do that. It's a dangerous neighborhood. You don't do that. But he knew who he was. He could handle himself, right? He was attacked by a mugger who tried to take his wallet. Guess what happened? unexpected to the mugger, he arrested the guy. He subdued him completely because he knew exactly how to do that. The mugger tried to get away, was very hyper, but he couldn't, and the police were delighted to catch this guy. They've been trying to catch this mugger, and they hadn't been able to. But he caught the guy and did whatever it would take to subdue him. Okay, so that's all okay. The context is care for widows, but the larger principle is all kinds of care, including protecting one's family. If anyone injures his neighbor, what do we do with this now? Okay, this is background to what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. We have to deal with when Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Does that rule out all self-defense? So we're going to look at that. Now, what it says in Leviticus 24:19-20 is, if anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. This is the so-called lex talionis, the law of retaliation. We know it by eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. This kind of penalty shows up in 3 places in the Bible. One is in Exodus, chapter 21. Another one is in Deuteronomy, which is the law of the malicious witness, who gets what he has coming to him, that he gets the penalty that would have been given to the other person if that malicious witness had convicted them. But here it's about assault. It's just straight out assault. Anyone is assaulting his neighbor, as he has done, shall be done to him. Okay, and this is perfect justice. Perfect justice, no mercy, just exact justice. They do it, they get the same thing done to them. That's going to be a deterrent, right? Pure justice, but listen to this. It's as a judicial penalty of retaliation administered by a court. Now, Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, referring to that law. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Is this ruling out self-defense? Now, of course, when it comes to self-defense, Jesus didn't defend himself when he was crucified. When there's an issue of principle, religious persecution, that kind of thing, that's one thing. But when it's a matter of a mugger on the street who's acting like a wild animal, is that, you have my wallet here, take my other, whatever else I have. Take my wife's purse. Is that what he's saying? No. For one thing, Jesus is talking here not about the judicial penalty. You've heard that it was said, but he's not wiping out the law of retaliation as a possibility for a court to give out. He's talking about vigilante action by individuals, getting revenge. Okay? So if someone does something to me, I want to get revenge against that person as an individual. That's what he's talking about. And then what he's saying is this is a strategy to shame the other person. And here's, okay, I think I have a quotation on this. Let's see if I have it. Yeah, there it is. Okay, let's go back just a little bit. Does Jesus rule out self-defense to protect oneself or one's family members from harm? Does he annul the penalty of retaliation administered by a court? No. He rules out individuals retaliating to punish others as a court would be justified in doing. Jesus does not rule out justifiable self-defense here. And here is a wonderful quotation from the Andrews Study Bible on Matthew 5:38-42. Some have seen this as a command for absolute pacifism. But if it is understood in the shame-honor society of Jesus, we might grasp the idea that while Jesus is ruling out physical retaliation, he supports other expressions of dealing with evil. To give the person your cloak as an undergarment also is to stand before them naked in that context. To look on someone who is naked is a shame, and I'm pulling it up, okay, is a shame. Thus, the Christian gently invites the abuser to experience shame for the deed. Okay, you're taking this, take this as well. Here I am, you got to look at me. That's what they're saying. Thus, the Christian gently invites the abuser to experience shame for the deeds. To insist on going the 2nd mile after you've fulfilled the legal requirement of taking the Roman soldier's load the 1st mile is to be in charge. It's really brilliant. Jesus is teaching an active pacifism. He rejects violent vengeance and retaliation, retaliation meaning revenge, but he's not talking about self-defense. He's just not addressing the issue of self-defense. Okay? See, the Romans could come along and they could commandeer, just like military can anywhere. I'm going to commandeer your car right now. There's an emergency, or whatever. Or just if they feel like, I don't want to carry this, so you carry it. And Jesus is saying it's like pouring hot coals. Later in the Bible, it says this: if you give someone good when they've given you evil, then you're making them wonder, what is this? What's going on here? An example of that is in Lincoln, Nebraska, years ago. There was a member of the Ku Klux Klan who was physically crippled. And he gave threatening and nasty, racist phone calls to a Jewish couple. And the Jewish couple found out who he was. They discovered that he was crippled. And they showed up at his house with a whole bunch of food and everything to give to him, because it was hard for him to get out to shop. What do you think that did to him? What kind of punishment is that? See? It totally melted him. And he became very good friends with them. So you see, that strategy, the way to destroy an enemy is to make a friend out of them. That's Jesus' strategy. Respect for animal life, treatment of animals. We were talking about you shall not murder, and respect for animal life is part of that principle behind the sixth commandment. Here's one: you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. That is adding insult to injury. The mother's milk is designed to nurture the life of that baby, and yet to use that to boil it after it's dead, that's not respecting the life of the animal. This is very interesting. God is showing respect, that we have to respect animals the way many people do not. I keep having to do this, by the way. I think there's an interface issue with the system. It's not apparently my computer. I try to do everything, but occasionally I just have to restart it, so bear with me. If you come on a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with its young. Again, here is respect for animal life. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Why? It's going to be hard on the donkey. The weaker animal is going to be having to pull beyond its strength. Respect animal life. What about eating clean and unclean meats? Animals that are pure means fit to eat. We say clean, but we're not talking about physical cleanliness. We're talking about being, the word is tahor in Hebrew, which is pure. That is, it's used for ritual purity also, but here it means fit to eat. Versus impure, tameh in Hebrew, which is unfit. The reason given in Leviticus 11 is because you're the holy people. That's the only reason given. It doesn't explain that it's going to be bad for your health because there's trichinosis in pigs and that kind of thing. It doesn't give those kinds of explanations. It doesn't say anything about, shellfish and all the rest of it. It just says, because you're holy. You have to trust me. So this is kind of radical obedience. Radical obedience is something God asks for from his people. We don't have to understand everything. It reminds me of a story about a mother and her 3 young children in Australia on a hot day walking along a dusty road many years ago. And it was, the children were just following behind her, and all of a sudden she said, "Stop." And they stopped. They obeyed. Just then, a big brown snake, deadly poisonous, aggressive snake, slithered across the road right in front of them. If the children had disobeyed, children might not have lived. One of them was Allison Nelson, who became a concert pianist. I heard her play with her husband, Harry Neal, who died a number of years ago. Allison Nelson was a superstar, a child prodigy in Australia, pianist. Okay, so radical obedience means obeying when you don't know why, because you trust the person who is instructing you. And that's what God asks from his people, to walk in by faith, not by sight. There is a basic distinction between clean and unclean animals that is timeless. And in 1 Peter it says, "Be holy as I am holy." And it's quoting from Leviticus chapter 11, where it is saying that you need to be holy as I am holy. And it's referring to those laws of clean and unclean meats. So there is no ritual remedy for violation. It's not a ritual issue, it's a moral issue. And what about Daniel? when he obeyed God's dietary laws because of holiness, personal holiness. It wasn't just a matter of holiness to not defile the temple. The temple was not in view. It was destroyed and it was hundreds of miles away. But he just obeyed these dietary laws, and God respected that and blessed him abundantly, including with secrets direct from God. Before the Israelite ritual system are these distinctions between pure and impure, fit and unfit animals, dating all the way back to the time of Noah. And they don't depend upon the sanctuary and the ritual system, as in the case of Daniel. So these are ongoing. No ritual remedies for violation. As I said, they're not removed by the New Testament. Therefore, these apply to Christians today who want to be holy as God is holy, following that New Testament advice. Treatment of trees. We don't think about that very much. When you come to the land, plant all kinds of trees for food. You shall regard their fruit as forbidden, literally uncircumcised in Hebrew. 3 years it'll be forbidden to you, shouldn't be eaten. In the 4th year, all the fruit shall be set apart. In the 5th year, you may eat of the fruit. So you have to wait. And in the year before that, you have to set it apart, meaning that you give it to the sanctuary, to God. Does this apply today? It shows God's concern for the environment. Also, there's another law in Deuteronomy 20 that says when you besiege a city, don't cut down the fruit trees. Okay? This is what happened. There was a lot of deforestation in the Middle East because of war. And that's why it used to be the Middle East was very lush. The climate was very different. We can read about that. There was a jungle down in the Jordan with lions in there. Small Syrian lions, not the big African lions. And when I went to Israel in 1978, it was so dry in Jerusalem. You could look out over the Judean hills, just bare. And one of the big reasons is war. The Romans cut down so many trees for siege works and for crosses. They crucified thousands and thousands of people. It was like a forest of crosses in 70 AD and the war leading up to that. But also, one of the worst things on the environment was the Turkish tax on trees that was in the 1800s. The Ottoman Turkish Empire put a tax on trees, including fruit trees and everything. So what did they do to not pay the tax? They cut the trees down, and the Middle East became deforested. When I went back to Israel, there's been a major initiative in Israel to replant, and they've replanted hundreds of thousands of trees all over that desert near Jerusalem, and you could feel the difference. There was humidity in the air, and it was a lot better for your breathing. Okay, God's concern for the environment, and the reasons for the metaphor of circumcision. The immature fruit is enclosed in a bud that's analogous to, okay? You can read what's up there. We have a family audience, okay? Removed and discarded. Emphasizes unfitness to eat, okay? So it's a way of God really expressing it in a colorful way that makes people really want to obey the law. The rationale for the law, God claims the promised land and the trees on it, just as he claims sons whose connection to him is shown by their circumcision. So God is concerned for trees, animals, people. No timeless religious requirement here. The rationale is tied to the special holiness of the promised land, and so it's not something that we have to do today, but there is a practice, a horticulture practice of taking care of trees that is in there. The modern horticulture identifies the ongoing practical benefit of not just eating the fruit right away, but letting the fruit mature so that, and then plucking it out and so on, just the way it says, and that is really good for fruit trees. Okay, so this is about that. Now, debt servitude, this is a more difficult topic. Particularly, at Andrews University, it's a very diverse university, one of the most diverse in the country. And we have in the seminary, white people are in the minority in the seminary where I teach. We have many more people from other parts of the world, many from the Caribbean, many from Africa and from Asia, South America, Inter-America. And so white people like myself, pale faces, it was never one of my things on my bucket list to be a pale face. Okay, but that's the way I am. So in any case, this is a tough topic with some of my students, particularly African American students, for an understandable reason. There was temporary servitude of Israelites, especially for debts. The main reason why you would get into servitude is debt. Like the story about the widow came to Elisha and said, the creditor is about to take my sons, make slaves out of them, because I can't pay the debt that my husband incurred. Remember that story? Okay? Because in those times, they took human labor as collateral. Now, when you go to buy a car, for example, or a house at the bank, they are not allowed to take as collateral you and your labor. Now, it didn't mean that the person who took these people to make them work for them, they didn't own them body, mind, and soul. They owned their labor to pay off the debt. It's kind of like when young people travel around the world and they get in some foreign country. They're out of money, but they're hungry. What do? Go in a restaurant, eat a meal. At the end, oops, sorry, we don't have anything to pay with. Where do they end up? In the dish room washing dishes. See? You pay off with what you have, and that's your labor. So people would pay off with debt servitude, and that was something that simply happened in that culture. Another reason for getting into slavery was warfare, if people were captured. The options were kill them or take them and control them and make them work for you. And that's what the Israelites did. The reason for the laws in the Israelite context was, as I mentioned, debt or other kinds of things that are different than in our culture. Timeless principles. Help those in economic need rather than taking advantage of their plight. Give them an opportunity to start over and treat your workers well. This is the principles that are in the biblical laws regulating servitude. Because once a person is dependent upon another person and they're enslaved by someone else, they're in servitude, slavery. There's no difference in Hebrew. Same Hebrew root, eved, is a servant or a slave. And that can be a very high person. Nehemiah was the eved of the king. He was a high official, but he was subordinate to the king. So there's nothing pejorative about being an eved. And in the New Testament, we are a doulos, the Greek word for servant, slave, of Jesus Christ. Nothing pejorative. Okay? But this was something where God was mitigating the worst effects that could happen. Because once a person was in that position, they were easy to exploit because they were under the control of that person. The person was feeding them, housing them, everything else like that. They had nothing, and so it was easy to exploit. And the Bible is saying, don't do that. And you've got to let them go after a certain period of time. And the Jubilee law, people don't get why. Scholars, in fact, a lot of scholars have thought that this is, it's a different biblical source that is not in agreement with the other source. None of this is from Moses, of course, as far as they're concerned, because a person is kept in servitude for a maximum of 49 years and then let go in the Jubilee year. Whereas in Deuteronomy 15 and in Exodus 21, it's a maximum of 6 years servitude. So the scholars say, these are two different sources. They don't agree. They're wrong. The reason why they're wrong is because they haven't examined carefully enough the text of Leviticus 25, where it makes clear the purpose of servitude, and that is because the person was not able to sustain themselves during tough times. You see? And so they sell themselves to someone who says, I'll work for you. They make a contract and so on. And furthermore, the text of Leviticus 25 says that the expense to them is half the cost of a hired servant. They're to be treated like a hired servant, they're getting paid a small stipend apparently, and then eventually they can redeem themselves if they want. That's a possibility. Or at the end, the Jubilee year sets them free exactly at the time that they get their land back, the ancestral land that they've had to sell. Now, there's a lot of detail there. I won't go into all the details about that, but it was they're costing the master twice as much as a regular slave would, okay? Because they're being treated as a hired servant. But the purpose of it is not to get out of that condition as fast as possible. It's to keep that condition until the Jubilee year when they get their land back, when they can survive, have an independent living. See? So God is extremely wise. And in fact, people at high international levels have realized the ramifications, the implications for international debt. Some countries that can't pay back debt to other countries, and so on. And places where people are given land to work, Tonga and I think Korea are two places, have done very, very well, where the principles of the Jubilee have been implemented. Now, we cannot implement it the way the ancient Israelites do because we don't have ancestral and land ownership set up by God at the time of the conquest. Are we going to give Manhattan back to the Indians after 50 years? That's what it would be like. So it doesn't really work for that land ownership that we have. But there are principles, and here they are. Help people rather than exploiting them. Charging them terribly high interest, that's an issue. And giving them an opportunity to start over. Treat your workers well. There was one more there. And lenders need to survive too. You see, God didn't say, if someone borrows from you and they can't pay you back, that you cannot get paid another way. God didn't rule out that kind of servitude. Why? Because people would have died. Because the lenders couldn't have afforded to do that unless they got help on the farm from the people helping them to work. So God is taking care of both parties, see, so that human beings will be willing and able to help their fellow human beings so that they would not die. This is not Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is not American racist, exploitive, grinding slavery. Okay? And the word slave has that connotation here in America. That's not what we're talking about. Of course, it's true that in Leviticus 25 it says with non-Israelites you can hold them and inherit them and so on. But non-Israelites would often be those who were taken captive in war and that kind of thing. But in fact, in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 23, there is a law that pulls the rug out from underneath exploitive, cruel slavery. Because it says, if a slave escapes from their master, okay, and comes to you to get help, you must help them. And you can help them to live anywhere in Israel. What's that mean? That means that nobody can exploit their slave, otherwise they'll run away, and other Israelites will be required to help them. And furthermore, slaves may come from even other countries. So God is wiping that out. And you find in Exodus 21 that a slave could decide to stay with the master. I like it here. This is comfortable for me. And so they can choose to do that. So obviously it's not too cruel, or they wouldn't choose to do that. All right. So in fact, there were protections also for any slaves, including those permanent foreign slaves like what Abraham had. And that would be they would get to keep Sabbath. Sabbath is for everybody. They would never have that back in Mesopotamia or Anatolia. And they would have the opportunity to go to the festivals and so on. So they would have a lot of benefits, and there were laws to protect them from harsh physical treatment, right there in Leviticus 21, 26, and 27. It was not that way in Mesopotamia. The laws of Hammurabi, if you assist a slave, you're killed. See? Capital punishment. If you just help a slave escape. Opposite, totally radically different. There it was much more like the fugitive slave law here in this country before the Civil War. Okay, levirate marriage, brother-in-law marriage. We talked about that a little bit. The reason for the law in the Israelite context was because people lived on through their descendants. Okay? And so it was very important to have, and it was passed through the male line. So you wanted to have boy babies, right? And to pass it on, father to son, so that the land in the promised land would have somebody's name attached to it in your family line, and you would have that legacy that is, so that you, when you're gone, you're not just going to be not even history. Now, there was a punishment called cutting off. If a person is cut off from their kin, you've seen that, then they're not even going to be history because they won't have. God will see to it that they will not have a line of descendants to carry on the family name. In fact, in Daniel 9:26, that is what the Messiah gets. He's cut off. That's a death beyond death. Not even history, but that applies to Jesus. And yet he came back from that and sees the fruit of the travail of his soul. He sees his spiritual descendants, the thief on the cross and so on, even though he's cut off. It's very, very powerful background to that. So this brother-in-law marriage was to keep the legacy of the dead going for the person who dies, who has no children. and also to take care of widows. These are principles that we do differently. We can do the same principles, we don't do them in the same way. In the New Testament, when Paul is talking about widows, he doesn't say, well, remember levirate marriage. He's talking about the New Testament church has to help in all kinds of ways, widows. Okay? And then we respect the dead in other kinds of ways. Praise the Lord for that. I mean, we like our sisters-in-law and brothers-in-law, but okay. All right, female vows. Annulment of female vows by fathers or husbands. On the day that a woman makes a vow, if she is unmarried in her father's house, or if she's married in her husband's house, which is also her house, of course, then if she makes a vow, then her father or her husband can annul that vow at the time that she makes the vow. That sounds sexist, doesn't it? Huh? The feminists really go crazy over these kinds of things. I'm talking about feminist scholars. There are a number of very prominent feminist scholars who read these laws, tear them apart, like the suspected adulterous ritual. This is extremely, anti-women and everything. Well, let's look at it just a little bit more. The reason for the law in the Israelite context. The timeless principle is respect for the wishes of family members when we contract obligations with God. But you see, in ancient Israel, what would a woman generally be vowing? A person vows generally to offer a sacrifice, right? Where does that sacrificial animal come from? It comes from the family herd or flock, which may be limited. And all it's saying is that the husband needs to agree. The wife needs to get agreement from her husband before she makes such a commitment. So, for example, otherwise, you could have a woman who's angry with her husband, and she says to herself, I can get even. And she vows to offer as a sacrifice to God the family ox. One ox the family has. That's his John Deere tractor. Okay? Next spring, he's going to be, or next fall, I guess it is, he's going to be doing his plowing by hand without that ox to pull. It's going to really cause him hardship. So this is focused on the family. Now, the interesting thing is God is unselfish. He, rather than saying, oh, I should have that animal, because I care about how many animals I get, he's saying, no, I care more about family unity and the family being happy, the husband and wife getting along, than I do about getting the animal myself. Because a vow is so serious that Jephthah really, you know what he did, and I won't say it because we got young ears here, but in Judges 11, it had very serious consequences for his family. Okay, you can read it there. And that was because once he made a vow, he couldn't take it back. You can't take a vow back because you'll offend the deity and you get all through the ancient Near East. That's a terrible, terrible crime. But here God makes one exception. This is the one exception. And he offers forgiveness by statute to the woman who makes a vow. Her husband annuls it. God forgives her for making that vow. And that's to make sure that they can cooperate together and not just have one doing the other way. Now, the husband, you see, was in charge of the family finances. The woman is responsible for many things. She was queen of the household. She did many things in the home. The husband was responsible for certain kinds of things, including representing the family on the outside to the elders at the gate and so on. And this is one of them, taking care of the herds and flocks. The economics was his responsibility. So that's why you don't have it go the other way. If he makes a vow, then she can annul it. It doesn't need to happen that way as well. Now, 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is saying that if one member of a married couple decides that they want to practice abstinence for a little while as a vow, they need to discuss it with their spouse. They need to have mutual agreement because it affects the other person. In other words, the principle is when there is a decision to be made that affects both people in a marriage, then be sure to consult with each other and make the decision together. Don't just make it unilaterally. Does that make sense? All right. God worked with the existing patriarchal culture rather than engaging in social engineering. He didn't say, well, the society shouldn't operate like that. No, he takes the society and he addresses it. This is how things can work the best. The same is true with slavery and polygamy. God worked with the society because, look, with polygamy, if God had just outlawed all polygamy, what would have happened? When a man would, men would divorce their wives. You remember the case of Elkanah and Hannah? Do you remember that story? Elkanah and Hannah? And Hannah couldn't have children. She was quite obviously the first wife. And if he hadn't been able to take a second wife, Peninnah, generally what an Israelite man would be doing is divorce the first wife and marry again. That's what we have in our modern American culture when people want to have a change. In fact, at the seminary I was teaching a number of years ago, and there was a guy from Africa, and he said, my father has 2 wives, my grandfather has 4 wives. He said, I don't justify polygamy, but at the same time, American serial polygamy, that is divorce, remarriage, like Phyllis Diller said, I'm a good housekeeper. When I get divorced, I keep the house. Yeah. This kind of serial polygamy is a problem. So God, if these women had been divorced in that culture, it's not like they can just go to and work in some capacity as a nurse or a secretary or something. There was only one profession that was available to them. I won't mention what it was. It's often referred to as the oldest profession. And so God was protecting people from either bad stuff like that or starving to death. And so he allowed things that were very, very unideal. But that doesn't mean that we come along today and we say, we can do those things because they're in the Bible. No, God is leading us to a higher ideal, as I talked about before, a higher trajectory. And in the New Testament, it makes it clear. The ideal is one husband, one wife, because that's the ideal carried out by church leaders. Okay, gender-specific garments. I was asked about this. How are we doing for time? 3:01. Oh, are we okay for a little bit? Okay. I was asked about this by email. I think it may have been the president of one of our institutions, a college or something like that, in the Caribbean, because they were having a big issue about that. You remember when, this would really date you, if you remember the big debate over pantsuits? Yeah? Now, Leona Running at the seminary was one of my colleagues when I joined there. She was entering retirement. She was my father's teacher many, many years ago. And Leona Running, Michigan is cold in the winter, right? So she showed up to the seminary one day wearing a pantsuit because it protected her legs from getting cold. The dean of the seminary said, you go home and you change into a dress and I'll cover your class until you get back. Huh? So it was a big deal because pants are what men wear. Women don't wear pants. Well, now we've come a long way, baby, haven't we? Come a long way, baby, to get where you are today. That used to be an ad for a cigarette, actually. But in any case, that's a question. What is gender specific? A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, including implements, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. What's the principle? How do we apply it? No specific description of what a man should wear or a woman should wear. This is determined by the culture, okay? And sometimes it's a fine line. In ancient Israel, both men and women wore what we would call dresses. But there was a little bit of difference in maybe the style, the cut, whatever, and other accoutrements that they would wear. Normally, a woman wouldn't be wearing a sword and a belt on her side, right? Okay? So, in other words, it's so that people would recognize your gender. And I remember at Berkeley, I went into a men's restroom one day. I walked in there and, whoops, I'm in the wrong place. I made a mistake. You know, that's a gender bender, right? Because there was a guy in there with long hair. It was a guy. He had long hair. I mistook him for a woman. See? That wasn't supposed to happen in ancient culture. Now, of course, people in ancient times also had long hair and that kind of thing, but the men, had beards, so that would help to differentiate them, and so on. So, no specifics limited to a particular culture. The question is, what is gender specific? Not shared by genders in a given culture, because some people share certain items of clothing, but some we don't share, okay? We won't go into the details. We know what we're talking about. Okay. Timeless principle. Don't confuse people regarding your gender in the changing cultural context in which you live. This is a moving target. You can't just say one size fits all. It has to be the way it was in 1950 or 1970 when I was, whatever. No, it's a moving target. But you should be able to recognize who's male, who's female. It's a bit challenging when everybody wears jeans, right? But there's different cuts of jeans and different ways of being gender specific. Okay, women speaking. Oops, maybe we better move on to the next one. Skip this one, huh? Oh, you want to have this one? Oh, okay. 1 Timothy 2, 8-15. Paul says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray. Can you see that? Lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. What's the principle there? He wants, instead of using your hands for violence, he wants you to use your hands to pray. They used to pray that way. Now, today it's mainly Pentecostals that pray that way, but in ancient times, Solomon prayed with his hands outstretched to God at the dedication of the temple. 1 Kings, I think it's chapter 8, right? And we have an ancient picture of a Canaanite standing on the wall of his city, praying to his God like that when the Egyptians are surrounding his city. So that's the way that they would pray in ancient times. Lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. So the principle is, instead of being violent, pray. Also that the women should dress themselves modestly, decently, and suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Now what's the principle there? Modesty, not having your apparel be an extension of your ego to express pride. Does this apply to men as well? Absolutely, absolutely. Now, hair braided. Did you ever see a picture of Ellen White without her hair braided? She always has braided a bit. But this is talking about in the Greco-Roman Empire. The rich women would have often slaves, and it'd be hours and hours and hours of very, very elaborate braiding of their hair, and often braiding gold and silver ornaments into them and everything like that. That's what he's talking about, not what Ellen White had. Okay? Now, gold, pearls, expensive clothes. It doesn't mention any diamonds, so diamonds are okay, no problem. Huh? Diamonds? Yeah. Madonna went to a function once years ago. I think she went with Michael Jackson, wearing $5 million worth of jewelry, a bunch of diamonds and stuff like that. Okay? So this is an example here. Yeah. All right. So there's a principle there, and that is to be humble and to be coming across that way rather than too ostentatious. Now then we get to, and you see, a lot of times people go straight to this next one without reading the context. What is the context? At the end of the previous chapter, the context is Paul is speaking about the church as a place of evangelism. When an unbeliever comes into the church, then there are various kinds of things that can make a difference as to whether that person has a proper attitude towards God, an understanding of him, or not. So these are the kinds of things. Then let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She's to keep silent. And then it says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived, became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Now, that's hard in our modern culture, isn't it? To deal with that. But we have to realize, in the context where they're functioning, where Paul is writing to, a lot of women, particularly in places like Ephesus, were involved in thinking they were superior to men in a number of ways and so on. And there was a philosophy that was very, very difficult, very damaging. So he's countering an extreme here for one thing. However, what is this? Is this a timeless principle because it refers to Adam and Eve? Is the issue there speaking in church? Eve shouldn't speak in church. Is that the issue? No. The issue is that Adam and Eve needed to operate within the sphere that God had for them. whatever that was, rather than being inappropriate. Eve was inappropriate. She went beyond what she should have done. Okay? But let a woman learn in silence with full submission. This was in a certain context where, if it had not been this way, and you had a woman like in charge or too much of a role or whatever, then the people coming in, unbelievers, would have assumed that it was connected or like one of these pagan cults where the women priestesses were in charge and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of baggage with that. Now, what is the timeless principle here? We've found timeless principles in the ones above. In other words, you shouldn't just necessarily say that whenever we pray, okay, if you take that literally, you have to always pray lifting up your hands. See, if you take that application, that example, as the principle, you say we should never ever pray without going like this. Do you find people in the Bible who prayed otherwise? Like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? Like Moses when he's falling flat on his face before the Lord when the Lord is about to destroy the Israelites? Like Nehemiah standing before the king praying within his heart? No, it's not the principle. Okay? You see, so we have to differentiate between the principle and the application. If we do that in the previous cases, we should in this case too. And the principle here is that what we do is to have a role within the church community that will be in harmony with having unbelievers come in and having them accept what is going on. Now, in modern American culture, if we forbid the women to do these things, we will have that result. People will be offended when believers come in. Wait a minute, where's your women? Okay? And Paul would say, by all means, have women doing these things, have them teach, have them on the platform doing these things, pastors, and so on and so forth. Because otherwise, the unbelievers coming in are going to have a very bad attitude about what's going on, and it's going to hurt your gospel mission. You see what I'm saying? So sometimes by obeying the letter of the law, ignoring the principle, when the letter is just an application that applies to a culture that's not ours, we can actually go against the principle. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. There's a lot more I could say about that, but all right. Timeless principles versus contextually conditioned examples. Men pray, lifting hands. Women be modest. Women not speaking in church. These are all examples of principles. Mixtures of clothing. Have you ever wondered why it was not allowed for the Israelites to wear mixtures of clothing? Have you ever wondered about that? Well, let's have a go at it. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you put on a garment made of two different materials. Now, if I take off my jacket or I look at my shirt, it's probably consisting of more than one material. The materials that are in view here are wool and linen. Now, actually, those don't mix very well because you can dye wool, but you can't dye linen. Linen is going to stay white pretty much. However, wool and linen mixtures in a certain way were reserved for the priests and for the sanctuary. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, here's the law in Deuteronomy 22, which gives us a key. Now, you remember I said this morning, for methodology, you look at the law, then you look at other laws within the whole system of laws to see if they shed any light on what you're looking at. Deuteronomy, you shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, or the whole yield will have to be forfeited, literally will become holy, belonging to the sanctuary, both the crop that you've sown and the yield of the vineyard itself. What's this about? Now, some translations have just flat out 180 degrees mistranslated this. They say the whole yield will become defiled. That's exactly the opposite of what it says. The Hebrew is yikdash. It means will become holy. What happens to something that becomes holy? You got to give it to the priest at the sanctuary. So if you do these mixtures, you can't use it. It won't benefit you because you're going to have to give it all away. Okay? Wait a minute. Why do mixtures become holy? Mixtures holy. Mixtures holy. Well, the key to understanding that rationale is mixtures belong to the holy supernatural realm represented at the sanctuary. You got the cherubim, mixed creatures, right? In Ezekiel, remember, mixed creatures guarding the ark. You've got the mixed sanctuary fabrics, the priestly garments. These are mixtures. And so that is reserved for the realm of God. that is outside the ordinary human realm. The reason for the laws is to protect the distinction between special holy spheres of the sanctuary and ordinary domain. Compare Exodus 30, the uniqueness of the sanctuary's anointing oil and incense, which are mixtures of special spices and different ingredients. Nobody else is supposed to make that, to keep unique what is happening at the sanctuary. Timeless principles. There are none to protect the uniqueness of the sanctuary or temple because it's gone. It does not matter because we do not have an earthly sanctuary to have things be separate from it. We can go ahead and have those mixtures. It doesn't matter. Humane treatment of work animals, not unequally yoked. That's another issue that we talked about. Marriage and divorce. I'll do this briefly. I think we need to wind up here pretty soon and have questions and answers. I'll just do this rather quickly. Genesis 2, permanent heterosexual monogamous union is what marriage is all about. Okay, and it's between human beings. This is the way the ideal was. God's ideal is setting up what he expects and what he wants. The laws are simply pointing to that, trying to help us get back to that ideal. So any other things are a problem. Now, permanent is a problem because we can die. We're mortal now. And so that means that remarriage after the death of a spouse is perfectly permissible. Heterosexual, this is not accepting anything else other than heterosexual marriage. Monogamous, not polygamy. And between human beings, no bestiality. Malachi 2 says the Lord is the witness to your marriage, and God hates divorce. A divorce, by the way, is expulsion. The word is shalach, which means sending someone away. Deuteronomy 24, the law here, is really a law about remarriage to your original spouse after an intervening marriage. That's what the law is about. So all of the first 3 verses are all when these circumstances apply. And then if a man divorces her because of indecency, the word for divorce is he sends her out. Okay? He sends her out, and he has to write a certificate for her. Why? Because it shows that she hasn't committed adultery, in which case she could be stoned to death. So it protects the woman. Then in verse 4, her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife. In other words, this protects her from wife swapping, and it means that before you divorce someone, you got to really think twice because you're never going to have another chance with that person, okay, for one thing. And so that's what that law is about. The law is limited to cases in which husbands choose to dissolve marriages, so they send her out. Verses 1 to 3 are a descriptive protasis in the law, if it's the circumstances. And then the verse 4 is what we call in law the apodosis, which is the then clause, that deals only with remarriage after an intervening marriage. So this is what the law directly regulates, is that. Divorce by expulsion according to an existing procedure is the condition under which the remarriage legislation applies. All right. Now, this is all very important because we'll see why. The primary purpose of the law is to avoid the abomination of remarrying a former wife after an intervening marriage. A secondary purpose, to discourage hasty expulsion. The woman's indecency is the real reason for the breakdown. It's not simply an excuse, okay? There has to be real indecency, short of adultery, for which the woman would have to be stoned to death. Now, you remember the woman taken in adultery in John 8, brought to Jesus. And they said to Jesus, what shall we do with this woman? What shall be done with her? Clearly an adulteress. And the law of Moses is clear. Stoned. But it also says, Deuteronomy 22 and other places, both parties to the adultery have to be stoned. Okay? Now, Jesus didn't raise that issue. He didn't say, where's the man? He dealt with it differently. But why did this come up? Why did they try to trip him up like this? Is because in the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin, it says that 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Romans withdrew from the Jews their right to carry out capital punishment. What's 30 AD? 40 years before 70 AD, right in the ministry of Jesus. So they're trying to trip him up by saying, you see, if he says, no, you can't kill her, then, oh, you don't believe in the law of Moses. So he loses his influence with the people. On the other hand, if he says, kill her, they'll report him to the Romans. See? They have him either way. And what he does is he just, okay, sure, admits she's guilty, just assumes that, but then he short-circuits the execution. Okay? Because only the righteous one should cast the first stone. And in fact, then he writes their sins in the sand, and they get freaked out, because if she's stoned, they're going to get stoned too. That's how he dealt with it. All right, so the woman is not expelled without cause, and indecency could include adultery, but under the theocracy, adultery would be punished by death. So here, indecency is less than adultery. Under Roman rule, the death penalty for adultery ceased, so adultery became a ground for expulsion, that is, divorce. And that's why Jesus said what he did. He allows expulsion only for porneia, sexual immorality, which includes but is not limited to adultery. It could be other forms of sexual promiscuity. And he raises the standard above that of Deuteronomy 24. Okay, so Jesus' statements on divorce referred to expulsion. Now, this is a key thing for application to modern life. Expulsion is only one kind of dissolution of a marriage. That's the husband says, you get out. But there are other ways that marriages can be dissolved. See, we call all of them divorce. But the Hebrew word for divorce is only one kind of divorce. Because Paul allows remarriage after another kind of dissolution of a marriage, which we would say happens through a divorce. And that is abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. In other words, the spouse is here, they're Christian, and the unbeliever, the spouse, just takes off, abandons them. So they're left without a marriage. Do they have a right to remarry? Absolutely. Paul says yes. Now, if we use our modern terminology, that person is divorced, so they don't have a right to remarry. And my uncle in Australia had his wife, his second wife, leave him because she just wanted to be with her children. This was later in life. And he was left without a wife. She abandoned him. Does that mean that he didn't have the right to remarry? He thought so, so he didn't. But biblically, he did. Okay? Paul does not contradict Jesus. Abandonment is outside the scope of Jesus' discussion. He was asked explicitly, can a man divorce his wife for any cause? That is, expulsion. Jesus was not addressing abandonment. That's another issue. The modern word divorce refers to legal termination of a marriage for any reason, but Jesus' biblical ground was for expulsion, only one form of what we call divorce. So there may be other legitimate circumstances for terminating a marriage. And then abandonment by an unbelieving spouse, assuming that a believing spouse would never abandon. If a believing spouse abandons, they're not a believer. They're worse than an unbeliever because they don't protect their family, according to 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. Another issue is passive abuse of a slave wife. Permanent injury of a slave from active physical abuse would free a slave, including a slave wife, from marriage. Serious physical abuse would be a reason for ending that marriage. Okay, that is not expulsion, that is because of physical abuse. And you could have a situation in which there's a person, and I know such a person, who fled from their spouse that they were afraid of, physically afraid of. They were threatened by a knife when she was pregnant, okay? So she fled, she left. That was the end of the marriage. And she remarried. Conservative Christian, remarried. Talked with me quite a bit about this. And I wrote an article in Journal of the Adventist Theological Society. And you see, because she didn't expel him, she didn't abandon him. She fled from him to save herself. Okay, that's another issue. Another thing is illegally contracted marriage in Ezra, where they were marrying non-Israelites, and that was forbidden in the first place. That was really annulment of something that never should have happened. The church should uphold biblical principles to preserve families as the basic units of society. There's the God of the Old Testament, Jesus, they agree on this. Ellen White, what did Ellen White say? Ellen White's sister, Sarah, was a twin. Sarah married a man, they had some children. Sarah died. And the husband married another woman, and they had some children, and then she went insane. She couldn't function as a mother. So by then he had like 5 children or something like that. In those days, a man could not survive with having children without having a woman to take care of them. He had to go and earn for the family to keep everyone. So he divorced the insane wife and married another woman to be a mother to his children. And Adventists said, kick him out of the church. Ellen White said, leave them alone. So this is showing really divine mercy. It doesn't show that that was ideal, but it was showing a situation that God understood, had mercy on that situation. All right? I'm going to stop this. It's homosexual practice. If I get into that, that's a little bit longer. Well, maybe I'll just do the first little bit. Leviticus 18 and 20 forbids homosexual practice. A very important thing to realize is that the Bible never forbids homosexuality as just the orientation that a person has. Okay? So we have to differentiate between homosexuality and homosexual practice, which is part of homosexuality. As Ted Wilson said in 2015 in South Africa at an Adventist conference on sexuality, where I was there, he made it very clear that the Adventist church, in line with the Bible, doesn't condemn a person for whatever reasons, just their orientation. It's whether you act on it. Look, I'm a heterosexual male, red-blooded, okay? I'm married, been married for 42 years. And I'm not condemned by being heterosexual. But if I act inappropriately on my whatever orientation, then that would be what the Bible condemns. Now, the problem with being homosexual is there is no biblically valid way to express yourself, to carry out those desires. You have to remain celibate. And that is something where I think the church needs to do a lot more in helping people in that very, very difficult journey. There's more and more people. And helping them through that very, very hard journey. We need to not shun them. We need to put our arms around them, love them, incorporate them, adopt them, and so on, and help them through, because it's incredibly difficult in a society where everything tells you, billboards, magazines, movies are all telling you sexual expression is an inalienable right. See? That's not a biblical concept. And there were great people, Jeremiah, Jesus, Paul, were single for the sake of the gospel. And I really admire people who have this struggle, and I know some who have chosen to remain pure. And some after conversion, and that's even more difficult after having a homosexual lifestyle and then being converted. There are no culturally dependent elements, untechnical language, in context of moral laws, so timeless divine condemnation of homosexual acts beyond homosexual tendencies. It rules out homosexual holy matrimony. Just because the United States, says it's legal doesn't mean that it's moral, okay, in the sight of God. However, it doesn't rule out protecting basic human rights of homosexuals in a modern, non-theocratic state. There is no excuse, for mugging, beating up, and all this kind of stuff. People, we don't agree with their orientation. Their lifestyle, I should say, not their orientation, but the way they express it. We don't agree with that. But they should have basic human rights. They don't have all the knowledge that we do, and we can't hold them accountable to all the belief that we do. We should stand up for their rights. Huh? And if we do that, then people will respect us a lot more, I think, for the stand that we take. This is a crucial issue in the church because our young people are really affected by this whole culture. Because if you read Time magazine or CNN or any of these kind of things, other news as well, the moral high ground is support of homosexual practice. That's the moral high ground. And we're saying the Bible says the opposite. So the young people are caught in the middle here, and wow, they're feeling that Christianity is really not Christian because it's not being kind, it's not treating these people as well as the outside society is. And we have to handle this very, very carefully with a great deal of love and compassion. I'm going to stop there. There's a number of attempts that have been made to avoid biblical condemnation of homosexual activity, including some attempts made by people who are SDAs. I've written on that. I have book sections on it and so on. but we're going to leave it there and take questions. Okay? And I'm going to get a drink of water. Hydrotherapy, right? It's the strongest drink there is. Floats battleships. Yeah. Go ahead.
Regarding the sacrificial system and understanding, certainly from what Paul says about our condition when he says, I try to do the right thing and I never can, and so on and so forth. Going back a couple thousand years, or maybe even in Paul's day, but go back to the original sacrificial temple there in the desert, the first one. How long was the line out front of that tent every day? How often did someone have to show up there with a lamb? And my perspective, if I had to do that, I'd be out of lambs pretty quick.
Uh-huh.
So how often did somebody have to show up there?
Logistics of the ancient Israelite sanctuary is something we don't know much about. What we do know is, at first, if you take the biblical numbers of the Israelites, literally, which I do, there would be 600,000 men of fighting age. The census was a military census, okay? And that means if you just have 600 men of military age, you give a normal population, including one that likes to have lots of children, you're going to have maybe 2.5 million, maybe 3 million people total. Now, people say, well, not that many people couldn't have survived in the desert. Well, that's what the Bible tells us, that they couldn't. That's why God had to provide for them, right? So as far as how they did all the sacrifices, now you see, we read it from the point of view of the Sermon on the Mount, where every thought of sin is, if you look on someone or if you hate someone in your heart, then that's a sin. They didn't offer sacrifices for all those things, but there was a high standard, and yet, first of all, the wilderness tabernacle, all the people are around there. And when it came time for the people to come and offer their sacrifices at the festival times, that's a lot of people, that's a lot of sacrifices. So there was a really efficient system that was set up. I don't know how they handled it in the wilderness camp with Aaron and his 2 sons. I don't know how they handled that. The offerers were the ones who did the slaughtering. They were the ones who did the butchering. The priests were the only ones who would put the blood on the altar. Anything connected with the altar, the priest did. But the people there in the forecourt would do the other parts. Now, they were used to slaughtering animals for food, like Little House on the Prairie. You read about that, right? This is not too far in the past. And so people weren't too squeamish about it. They knew how to do it. They were efficient about doing it. And this was food for God, token food for God, not that he needed human food. By the time we get to the second temple, Herod's temple, Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote in Greek, he wrote the Jewish wars and antiquities of the Jews. Josephus tells us that at the time of Passover, which was one of the huge pilgrim festivals, people would come. There were as many as 3 million people who would come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And this is why it was a big problem, because at the end, a lot of these people were there for a festival, and then the Romans showed up, surrounded them. So many more people than the infrastructure could handle on an extended basis. In the Jerusalem temple, we know more about that in terms of infrastructure. They had tables for slaughtering animals. They had hooks for heavy animals that you can lift up. They had a huge number of priests and then Levites helping them and so on. And they had pipes draining the blood from the base of the altar, because it's a lot of blood, out into the Kidron Valley. So there was an extensive infrastructure. How long was the line? It was very long, extremely long. And it took a lot of time, it took a lot of manpower, and so on. A lot of things we don't know. We don't know also how the inside of the sanctuary was cleaned, necessarily. People ask me that all the time. We know that the ashes were cleaned out according to Leviticus 6. Otherwise, the altar couldn't go. But otherwise, how did they clean the Holy of Holies? It's not given. Yes?
Where I was really going with this was there an interpretation
No. No. No and no. For one thing, for them it was actions. Okay, you shall not covet, of course, is thoughts, but you get the rules for the circumstances under which you offer different sacrifices. Now, one thing people that wonder about is, well, in Leviticus 4, the sin offering is only for certain minor sins, unintentional, or ignoring a call to testify in Leviticus 5, verse 1, or forgetting purification, ritual purification, or forgetting a vow that you've made to the Lord. So just minor sins, unintentional or forgetting, or that one case of ignoring a vow, which could be due to fear, and so on. So God had mercy on that. Then, and that's the sin offering. Now, a lot of Adventists think the sin offering covers all sins. Well, it didn't. And then the guilt offering was for sins of sacrilege, sins or suspected sacrilege. That is to say, for example, if you don't pay your tithe on time, and that's unintentional, then you have to pay it back with a 20% penalty. Or if somebody uses God's name, taking an oath to say that they're innocent when they really weren't innocent, in order to defraud somebody else, that's misusing something sacred. That's sacrilege. Or in a case that you think you might have done something wrong, but you don't know what it was, it could have been sacrilege, so you also offer a ram for that. So these are specialized cases, all right? They do not cover all sins or guilt. And the translations, sin offering and guilt offering, are a bit problematic. Better to call them purification offering and reparation offering, because there's reparation made for an economic loss to God or someone else, okay? And but then what sacrifice is going to cover most of the sins that we think about, the intentional sins, short of being a high-handed, defiant sin that's rebellion against God, that wants to cut off the covenant with him, for which there is no sacrifice? The answer is the burnt offering. The burnt offering was the original expiatory, which means removal, sacrifice. Job offered that. Remember, it was around Noah's the first time that offers a burnt offering, which was an all-purpose sacrifice. The patriarchs offered burnt offerings, Abraham as well, and therefore many different kinds of things. And so it says in Leviticus 1, verse 4, that the person must lean their hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall expiate or effect removal, translated make atonement, for him. And so, but it doesn't say what it atones for, because it's left open. And the burnt offering had been around there for a long time. And then when the sanctuary was established, you have these specialized sacrifices to deal with sins that especially affected the sanctuary. Sacrilege affects God, who is holy things, is right there in the sanctuary. And then the so-called sin offering, the unintentional ones, that's the only kind of sacrifice that defiles the sanctuary, that the sin goes from the offerer to the animal to the sanctuary. Most Adventists think that it's all sacrifices that did that. That's not correct. In Leviticus chapter 6, verses 27 and 28, it says that if the blood of a so-called sin offering gets on a garment, it has to be washed off. Okay, why? Because there's some kind of residual contamination, whether from the sin or the ritual impurity that the sacrifice deals with, which gets there, has to be washed off. But what if the priest then, which he does, puts the blood of the same animal on the altar, conveys that residual contamination to the altar? And the altar is part of the sanctuary, so the whole sanctuary is affected. That's only that kind of sacrifice in Leviticus 4, verse 1 to 5, verse 13. To answer your question, I'm giving you a lot more than you probably wanted. The concept of what they would offer sacrifices for was more limited. And it was limited to the very external, obvious kinds of things. Jesus comes along and expands the view of sin to the roots that are in the mind and the attitudes that are leading to the actions. The Israelites were not offering the sacrifices for those. But the fact that it was expensive to sin, if you were a really faithful Israelite, it was expensive. You weren't supposed to sin, and you would think twice before doing it because it's going to cost you. Now that could teach us something. If we would do that on a personal basis to help train ourselves, not somebody imposing it. Ellen White talks about this, says it's a good idea. And if we would, commit a sin we know, it's something that is really bothering us that we keep making this mistake. How am I going to overcome this? Well, pray to God, the Holy Spirit. But one thing that can help is make it expensive for yourself. Put in an extra $10, $20, $100, $1,000, The conference is not going to complain. Did I answer your question? Or there's more?
Not completely, but I'm not sure anybody could.
I think you're right. I think I've gone just about as far as we can with the available evidence. Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned last evening that as we encounter God, we come up against some absolutes. I was intrigued by that because it seems that a lot of my experience with God is more conditional than absolute. And I also find myself tempted to apply absolutes to other people rather than myself. It's real handy to do that. I happen to know what God feels is absolute, whereas others might not. So I'll tell them. So I'm wondering with these absolutes, could you expand on that a bit? Are these moral or spiritual or relational absolutes? Are they values? Are they principles? Are they laws? And could you give me a little bit more about what you intend in that area?
Excellent question. I'm talking about principles because there's a lot of variation in the application of principles. I think we've seen that today. There's a lot of variation in application. There's a lot of ifs. Many laws are formulated casuistically, that if this, then this. And then there's different options and alternatives. And there's different situations. We saw culturally it's different in Ephesus than it is in Coeur d'Alene, right? And so on. But then when we say absolutes, there is an absolute demand for respect for life, okay? So that you don't go and just wipe out people like during the Holocaust, like the Nazis were doing. You don't invade a country and murder people and do all the rest of those things. That's running up against principles that are absolute. When I was talking here, I was asked a question by the young lady about talking in church, and reverence, and I was talking about that. I don't have an absolute on that, as you could see. There's different circumstances. There is an absolute of reverence for God. There's also an absolute of compassion and concern for our other people, okay, and needing to communicate with them. And then we have circumstances of where we are, how much infrastructure we have, the alternatives we have, the kind of things we're dealing with. And, social meeting. Ellen White talked about the importance of the social meeting. The Methodists had the social meeting, which is like a testimony meeting and so on. It's very important to come and God's people speaking to each other. And in Malachi, there's a blessing for God's people speaking to each other, okay? Which is absolutely appropriate in a place like this, within the context of speaking to each other in the context of Christian fellowship and about God and so on. What would not seem to be appropriate in terms of that would be the more common chatting, right? Which would be more appropriate to some other place. But as I said, there again, you have to be very careful about making absolutes because there may be a place where we have to do those things. We have to do everything we do within a certain space. And so how do we deal with putting these principles together? Because there are the absolutes, but then there are the variables. We have to deal with both of them, or we have to balance them. That's where James 1:5 comes in. If anyone prays to the Lord for wisdom, then he will give them wisdom. And we need to discuss with one another. And when we discuss with one another in a church, including the issue I was talking about reverence in church and so on, we need to not just discuss among the older folks. We need to involve everybody in the church. It's very, very important. And we need to hear other perspectives. And not just lay down the law and say, you got to do it like this. Now, because when I'm saying something, I'm fully aware that I'm 66 years old. And I may be saying something that needs to be culturally conditioned in a way that I need to hear and respect a perspective of someone else in a different generation. I'm completely aware of that, okay? So when I say something, I'm just telling you what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking, but I'm not going to say to you, as I said, when I speak, one thing I'm afraid of is that people will believe me. That they'll take me, this is what Roy Gaines said, therefore that's law. No. We got to work with all these things. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks again for coming and providing a lot of clarity on this topic of the law. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
I missed a lot of today's, so if you've covered something, I'm sorry. I particularly like Friday nights with the law based in love and everything. And when I see God's love in action, I see him always trying to take something that's horrible and make it good and make it glorify God in the end. Like an abused person could become someone that helps abuse people, or someone who's lost someone can be a comfort to somebody else. Even the results of sin being death, God has turned death into a way of saving us. And even how this earth is probably the worst place in the universe, it will be a beacon of his love in the end, right? And I see him trying to teach us along the way to understand that and understand him more, because he is love. So I'm just trying to set a little groundwork, and I hope I get my thought across correctly. But earlier, I think during the church sermon, normal sermon time, I thought maybe I understood you saying that some of these laws and some of these sacrificial things, the tabernacle, were more than symbolic, like they were required maybe. And when I look at some of the surrounding history of the ancient Near East, it seems like the tabernacle wasn't wholly unique, like it wasn't necessarily like God's original thought, like, hey, I've thought this up, Moses, and you build it and do it, because it very much mirrors what else was going on around that time. They put deities in tents. When a pharaoh would go out to battle, they'd build a border around him, an entryway, and then his place where only he sat that no one could approach. There's a lot of kind of like mirroring examples. And so I almost wonder, is God taking what they thought they had to have, they needed a God present there, and all these sacrifices and everything, and saying, okay, this is what is going on around you. I mean, people were sacrificing children as well, and Israelites even wanted to do that. And I'm going to use that, I'm going to change that, I'm going to I guess, usurp what is happening there and bring it to my end, my goodness. And I formulate that plan based on what's going on around with you, and you led them all the way to the cross using that. Or was it more symbolic than that? Did that stuff have to happen?
Great point. In my sanctuary
Hopefully I
court,
was clear, sorry.
That's a great question. No, I understand. In my sanctuary court, I have a bunch of slides on this computer here, which shows layouts that archaeologists have found foundations of ancient temples going back to the 3rd millennium BC, before the time of Abraham, that have bipartite structures of temples like the Israelite sanctuary. Okay? And in the time of the Sumerian king Urukagina, others read it as Uru-Inimgina, before the time of Abraham, about 2100 BC, there was ritual attested with ritual laying out of bread in loaves of multiples of 12. Okay? That's a bit like the bread of the presence. Maybe it had to do with the zodiac or something like that, but it certainly wasn't the 12 tribes of Israel. We find so many. In fact, I wrote the Leviticus portion of the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary on the Old Testament, published by Zondervan. And in there, I show many, many different kinds of cultural connections in the ancient Near East with the Israelite sacrificial system on many different levels. So does this mean that the Israelites just borrowed what was there in the surrounding culture, as some scholars think, many scholars think? Well, in the Bible, according to the Bible, where did sacrifices begin? The first sacrifice we have attested is the sacrifice of Cain. When some people think that it was a sacrifice when God apparently killed animals to make clothing for Adam and Eve. That was not a sacrifice. A sacrifice is sacrificare, make sacred. That is giving something over to the divine realm. It's a gift. It's an offering to God. That was not an offering to God. And we don't know for sure who killed the animal or whatever. It was not Adam killing the animal, making it the first sacrifice. The first sacrifice is in Genesis 4, the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. And the word there is mincha. It refers to really tribute. They're paying tribute to God. That is what you give to a superior person as a gift to acknowledge them. And so that's where sacrifices showed up. And then we have the sacrifice of Noah right after the flood. So the idea of sacrifice did not begin with Satan or the pagans. It began with God. Now, Satan tried to subvert the whole system, which he did, in all kinds of different ways, making it incredibly elaborate, in many cases very immoral, to have sympathetic magic to help the fertility of the land by immoral kind of stuff going on between priests and priestesses, all kinds of stuff. And in fact, the ancient religions, like modern religions that are occult religions, means that those ancient gods were really demons. They were worshiping demons. Makes that clear in Deuteronomy when Moses says that, and then Paul says it in 1 Corinthians, that the sacrifices to pagans are sacrifices to demons. Okay, so Satan perverts all of that. God comes along, and then you have the wilderness sanctuary, which is a copy of the one that's in heaven. So you've got apparently two apartments, you've got certain items of furniture, and so on, and it's copied after the one in heaven, not other ones on earth. However, how do we account for the great similarity between the Israelite sanctuary and other sanctuaries on earth, even before the old Israelite sanctuary, sometimes long before? Well, who is Satan? Where was he? Was he ever in the heavenly sanctuary? Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14. He knows what it's like. So when he had people make counterfeits, he was able to make them make counterfeits that were similar to the one up there, but then changing things. Now God comes along, and rather than having the laying out of bread, the ancient people laid out meals before their gods twice a day because people ate twice a day. They fed their gods. To the extent that in the Babylonian epic of Atrahasis, it's a creation flood epic, after the flood, the Noah figure, Atrahasis, name means exceedingly wise, offers a sacrifice, and the gods come crowding like flies because they've been going green from starvation during the flood when there were no humans to give them sacrifices. They're dependent upon human sacrifices. And so God takes that idea of they feed their gods. And in the ritual in Leviticus 24, I wrote an article on this in Vetus Testamentum years ago. In the ritual, bread is put in front of God. Okay, so what's the point? The point is God lives in a house. He's really with you. He's dwelling with you. There's light, there's incense, there's food. The food, though, is burned up, most of it, on the altar. It's a food gift for him. But here's this bread. This is really food, and it's laid out just like the Mesopotamians and the Hittites and the Egyptians lay it out in front of their gods. Is he really eating that food the way the other people thought that the gods ate that food? The answer is no, because incense is put on it. And then on every Sabbath, not twice a day, but once a week. Does that mean God has a metabolism 1/14 the speed of the other deities? No, because on Sabbath, he gets only the incense as an azkarah, the memorial portion, is burned on the altar. And the priests eat the bread. Now, the Hittites, the priests, according to the Hittite instructions for temple officials, the priests ate the bread after the god had it, but the god was assumed to have eaten the bread, but kind of metaphysically symbolic, and then the priests ate it after the god ate it. But in the Israelite system, it was a substitution where God ate only the, he didn't eat the bread at all, because at the same time as the bread is given, I've got to plug this back in. Well, I'll worry about it later. I think it's okay. At the same time that the priests ate the bread, God got the incense. So it was not that God ate the bread and then the priests ate it. And so what is happening here is by a little bit of difference, God is making a 180 degrees opposite theological point. Instead of you feed me, I feed you. It's a token of him feeding the tribes of Israel. So this is just one example, an important one though. And what we find is that these two things help to account for a lot of that. One is that Satan perverts, but he has that knowledge. Another thing, though, is that God reaches people where they are, and I think that's what you were getting at. The Canaanite language. Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect. God didn't invent a heavenly language to give the most profound concepts people had. They used the Canaanite language, basically. Okay? So he meets people where they are, which teaches us something about missiology, our evangelism and mission. We need to meet people where they are. And you take the internet. The internet is, I think it's going to be a key factor in the gospel going to everybody. You can penetrate to people's houses. You don't have to go door to door. It's incredible. It's also a cornucopia of concupiscence. I mean, it's just offering all kinds of evil. But it's a neutral medium. It can be used for good or for evil. And so that's the way a lot of culture is. And what God does is he takes things that he can use, and then, yes, it's in harmony with his big plan, but he'll use it for his purposes. Now, I'm going to end with saying this, that Satan often shoots himself in the foot because God is smarter. God is smarter than Satan. You take the Gadarene demoniac. Okay, this is in the country of Jordan. I've been to the place. The Gadarene demoniac. And he begs to go with Jesus. He doesn't know anything. Moments before, he's been insane. He wants to go, he feels safe with Jesus. This is the man who delivered him. Please take me with you. Let me get in the boat. Jesus says, no, you just stay here. You tell all your friends and family what God has done for you and how he's been merciful to you. That's all. No MDiv degree, no theology training, no nothing. All he tells is his personal testimony. Guess what? That is the most powerful witness in the universe. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Angels do not have that testimony. Okay? And so that's so important. Do not undervalue your personal testimony. That is much more powerful than a great deal of knowledge. Yes, knowledge is wonderful, but your personal testimony of, I was like that, and this is what happened. God provided a miracle for me. And that's what this special music was about at church.
I think we have one more question.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for your presentation as well.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
I'd like to say thank you for the presentation as well, because
thank you.
These Old Testament things a lot of times aren't spoken about, and we read them in the Bible, and a lot of times we're confused or don't understand what we should or shouldn't, or just the whole bit about it. But this brought me to think about the statutes and judgments that's spoken of, and it said that that's forever, and that we're supposed to keep. So I'm wondering, a part of the presentation, which are statutes and judgments, or if they are all, and just how do we understand that?
About the judgment being forever?
No, the statutes and judgments.
Oh, the statutes and judgments being forever. Good question. I understand what you're saying. There are several different words for law in Hebrew. There's Torah, Mishpat, Mitzvah, and Hukah. Hukah is a word often translated statute. It's from the root hakak, which refers to inscribe, like inscribe in stone. You wouldn't want to make a typo when you're inscribing in stone, right? It wouldn't be good. There's no control Z. But many times it says that this is eternal throughout your generations, and it uses the word olam. Okay, words for eternal in Hebrew and Greek can be conditional. That is to say, as long as the nature of the subject allows. For example, in the New Testament, Sodom, according to Jude, I think it's Jude 7, if I remember correctly, Sodom was burned with eternal fire. Okay? Well, I've been to that part of the world where Sodom is, in the country of Jordan. In fact, I've been to Bavadra, which archaeologists identify as the likely site of Sodom. There is no fire burning there today, I can assure you. Although the day was as hot as the other place. It was really hot there. No, and it's eternal fire. How do we deal with that? Well, it means, eternal means it burns till it burns out. It burns out completely. It's complete. So the word eternal can mean different things in different contexts. And you find in the Bible that these statutes which God gave the people, why aren't we keeping them now if they're eternal? Okay? Because it was eternal within the context, the framework of what was going on, which was a system of typology, types and shadows pointing forward to Jesus. Once they met their fulfillment, then that was it. So in other words, it's a way of saying permanent as long as they're needed. Yeah. Other things are, and it's context. You've got to take the meaning of that word by context. Like the Sabbath is eternal in the absolute sense. We can see that from other evidence. Does that help?
Yes, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. By the way, that's very important for the issue of eternal burning hell. Because in Revelation it says that there's eternal fire, right? And so on. And that means burned until they're burned up. Annihilation. It doesn't refer to eternally burning hell. You know, the idea of eternally, can you imagine being in heaven and you're having to, you know that there's the screams of your loved ones that are suffering through the ages of the eons and of eternity. Is that going to be heaven for you? Your child, your parent, your aunt, uncle, whatever. I don't understand. I just don't understand. Yeah. Okay.
We have a PS.
Yeah, so, because I know you talked earlier about, like, marriage, we don't necessarily have the same understanding of divorce, like as Jesus was talking about, and they're talking about in the Old Testament.
Right.
And it makes me think of the story of, like, when, like, I think it's like Ezra 10 or something, when he's, like, they felt impressed to do away with, like, all their wives that were taken from, like, other cultures, like idolaters or something like that. Like, how did that apply then versus, like, how would that apply now? Because, like, I feel like just because you're married to someone who doesn't believe the same way, that doesn't give us, like, the right to divorce and leave them.
Right. Yeah, this is in a theocratic context with God being in charge. And the issue was that those were illegitimate marriages. God had told the Israelites, do not make covenants with them, do not intermarry with them. And it was for an existential reason. It was for the survival of the nation. Because if they did that kind of thing, then they would be affected by their idolatry and the rest. Look what happened to Solomon. What Solomon did doomed his nation. It took hundreds of years, but it doomed it. It was already doomed. It reminds me of when my family and I were at Cape Canaveral, where the Kennedy Space Center is. My daughter was young. We were there on vacation down in that area. And we witnessed the launch of the Columbia. And my daughter was very excited about this because she knew all the astronauts on board by name. We'd gone to the Space Center. She learned all about this. And the Columbia burned up on re-entry. When it came back, it was Sabbath. I was preaching in the Daytona church in Florida. And Sarah comes running, Daddy, and she told me the news. It was horrific. Now look, it burned up on re-entry because of a damage to the exterior of the shuttle at takeoff. We were watching that takeoff. We saw when the problem occurred when it went down later. So it was doomed already when we saw it. Israel was already doomed because of what Solomon did. It was a terribly, terribly bad thing. Now, Ruth was a Moabitess, right? But what did Ruth say? I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Your God will be my God. This is very, very different, isn't it? As opposed to what's happening in the time of Ezra. These people had directly, deliberately violated the law of God, and their children were becoming unbelievers and all the rest of it. So God had to nip that in the bud. Otherwise, it would have destroyed the nation. Now, in Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians, he talks about this in chapter 7. If there is a believer married to an unbeliever, don't divorce them for that reason. Because for one thing, one may be converted and the other one was not, and so on. Don't divorce them for that reason. Be faithful, be a good witness, and so on. And so that's very different than that situation. So really that doesn't apply today. We should not be doing those kind of things. Another thing that we shouldn't be doing is holy war. Holy war applies under the theocracy. It doesn't apply now. So let's not use that as an excuse for divorce. Another issue, since we're involved in this is a pastoral counseling issue, right? One other issue is this that is a practical interest. Years ago, there was a man who said to me, he said, the reason I married my wife, and I was there at his wedding, in fact, I preached the sermon, didn't know about this. The reason I married my wife is because we already had premarital sex. And I was told by a friend that that establishes a marriage. Okay? That's not biblical. In Exodus, it makes very clear, in the Bible, it makes very clear, if this happens, premaritally, then, and it's not a good match and the father forbids it, then the man has to pay the bride price, but they don't get married. It can be a mistake. Furthermore, what did Jesus say to the woman at the well? You have had 5 husbands, and the man that you're now with is not your husband. That does not establish a marriage. Okay? That's a very important thing to know. And then another thing that this guy said was, I want to get rid of my wife now. I want to divorce her. But there hasn't been any adultery involved. But he said, I have lusted after other people. Therefore, Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount that it's like you've already committed adultery. So that's ground for divorce. Huh? You see the reasoning behind that? No, it doesn't work that way. The ground for divorce is not, it's doing the action. It's not just watching pornography. It would be something interactive. We won't describe the details of what that could be. So we have to take these things logically and not rationalize. There's a lot of rationalizing that people do.
Well, thank you. There are leftovers in the foyer.
Sorry?
There are leftovers in the foyer from lunch.
Oh.
Thank you for coming.
Oh,
If
okay.
anyone wants to grab a leftover food in the foyer on their way out, please do.
Lovely. And thank you, all of you, for coming. And thank you, Ashley, for arranging this and your hospitality and this church. I think this is a wonderful place, and I wish you God's blessing. May this community of Coeur d'Alene and the whole surrounding area be just lit up by the most loving group of people, which I think you definitely, that's what Jesus wants for you, and I think you are. Let's have a prayer, shall we? Father in heaven, we thank you so much for all the detail. When we are getting acquainted with somebody and we love them, we want to have a relationship, we don't want to know the minimum possible. We want to know the maximum possible. And thank you for sharing these things with us and helping us negotiate and navigate through this challenging life, this fallen world in which we have evil coming at us from all sides, Satan trying to lead us down the garden path and scam us on all sides. And yet you give us this sound counsel. And yet you realize the variability in our lives and the way that principles can be carried out in different ways. May we be true to you, give us wisdom as to how to do these things, but above all, may Jesus shine through our lives, and may it be known to others that we've been with you, because we have. May we spend time with you every day. May we allow your Spirit to pour love into our hearts. And I just pray that you would be with this church, with this community. And please come soon. Come very soon, Lord. We want to see your face. In Jesus' name, amen. By the way, I'm going to say one last thing to you, and that is, I believe I'm going to see Jesus coming again. I believe I'm going to be alive when he's coming again. I have reason to believe that. And it's going to be soon. You can see that there's a lot of different things leading up to that. We don't have very long. So the things we're talking about are things to internalize, to share, to learn from, and above all, to have that love, which is the end time message. The 3 angels' messages, the Elijah message, and the latter rain is all about God's love. And we need to get back on track instead of tearing each other apart over policy side issues. We need to be, I think some of you know what I'm talking about. We need to be united and really get back on track with our mission. Okay? That's my altar call. God bless.